Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So what we're going to be doing this time is we're going to be making a little bit of a helper extension to the editor. So one of the things that I find really handy and I really like in Unreal is I can right click on an existing class and go, cool, create a child class of this. And that's really handy, saves a lot of time. So I want to set up so that we can do that in Unity. Also being able to right click on something and go, cool, give me a custom inspector for this. So that's what we're going to be setting up today. So our starting point for this is we actually need to create our script. Now this script has to be in an editor folder. And what we're going to do is this, we're just going to call this editor code helpers. So this is going to house a lot of the logic. And so the first thing we need to do is when we open this up, we're going to get rid of any of the bits with mono behavior because this is never going to be a class that's attached to anything. So we can clear out this. We don't need start or update either. So first thing I want to do is I want to bring in Unity Editor. I want to add in those menu items. So I want to have a menu item. So this one will be for adding the child class. So to add that menu in, I can just do menu item, and then I can say assets, code helpers, and then I can say create child class. So just with that alone, that will be enough that I can right click on this script. We have code helpers, create child class, but I can also right click anywhere and I see that code helpers and can access it. So as well as creating a bit of a folder for our base class that we'll be able to do some testing with, I want to make sure that this only reacts when we have selected code. So I want it to be that when I right click on this, I see the option for doing create child class, but not when I just click anywhere. So we can do that. With menu items, you can create a validation function. So how that works is once you've got the empty item there, I usually at that point duplicate it. And then what changes is here up in menu item, we say true. We call this validation, and this actually returns a bool. So this function determines whether or not that menu item actually should be there. So what I can do is I can say, okay, well, if we have a selection and we've selected an active object, not an active game object, but an active object, and so that'd work for if it was a scene or a image or code, so it'll work for everything, but I want to restrict this to it specifically being code. So I can say, okay, well, if selection active object is a monoscript, so monoscript is a type that wraps around and holds any of our source files. So if it's a monoscript, and just as a final little bit of a safety check to make sure that we've got an actual asset ID for this, so it's a genuine thing that exists in our asset database, we'll just check that there is a single GUID selected. That also means if we had multiple selected, that will only have it work for a single one. So we have to only select one item. So now, here, I can go code helpers, but I can't select it. But on my base class, I can. So that's good. We've got that first part of it only being visible, accessible when we actually have a class selected. Now I'm also going to set up R1 for creating the custom inspector. So create custom inspector. And you do with the validation sort of functions, you want to make sure the path here matches perfectly. Custom inspector. And just call it like that. So now we're actually ready to start implementing the logic for this. So what we ideally want to have happen is we want it to, like what happens when we create a script. So I go to create a new script, I get this editor where I can control the name of it, and that name gets used. And if I do escape, it cancels it out. So I want to actually have it do that. And what I'm going to do is, because there might be multiple types of things that I'm creating here, I am going to set up so that we have a helper class. Now I'm going to make this class internal to the editor code helpers class. We can have one class inside another. The reason I'm having it internal is so that it's able to be a little bit more sort of self-contained, keeps it a little bit sort of cleaner and neater. So with those set up, now I can start to set up the actual logic for what it's going to be doing. So what I ideally want to be able to do, something like this, where I can go, okay, a internal function, or everything's there private, so it probably doesn't need to be an internal one. I could call it perform creation. And I'll be able to tell it the type of thing that it's creating would be really handy. So I'm going to actually set up a enum, and we'll call this creation mode. So I want to have child class, custom inspector, and we could add in other ones as we need later. So I want to be able to then go perform creation. Now, this is a child class, and what might be handy is to be able to give it a reference sort of name, so a default name that gets populated when it goes to create that file there. But part of that is going to be fixed because I would want it to be, something child, something editor. But part of it also needs to be dynamic. It needs to be based upon the class that we're actually creating the child for. So I'm going to set up a little marker in this that I can then do a string replace on to substitute in the actual name. So I'm going to put this as ref class name child. Whereas for the editor one, be the exact same line, but what it's going to do is editor, and rather than child class, it's a custom inspector. So now I just can have the one function, and it still needs to be static like the other ones. Call this perform creation. We have a mode, and we have our initial file name effectively is what this is controlling. So initial file name. So now we need to have it create that particular file. We also need to know what name to substitute in. So firstly, I'm going to load that selected asset. So to do that, I want to get the asset path from that selection. So I can go asset database, and I can go GUID to asset path, and then I can give it the selection asset GUIDs and the first one. Then I can get that actual script asset. So the script asset, we have our selection and our active object as a mono script, because then our file name becomes, I'm going to change that so it's consistent with how I'm spelling file name. So this, I can take my initial file name, and I replace this with, I can go script asset, and I can actually ask it, okay, well, script asset, I can get the class that it's holding in there and the name of that class. So now that will end up just automatically substituting in the name of whatever class we've selected, which is really handy. Now we need to have it create that actual file there. So the line for doing this is a really hard one to track down. And a thanks and a shout out to Calvin, who had done similar stuff to this before and had figured out the convoluted but ever so helpful line that actually shows up this editor. So what you use is you use project window util dot start name editing if project window exists. Then we can, 0 is usually good for the instance ID. Now we need to give it this end action, which we'll get to in a moment. For now, I'm going to put that as null. We do give it the path name. So this has to include the file extension. So we do a file name .cs. So if we don't include that file extension, it won't have any extension, so it must be provided. We can, if you want to give it a particular icon, you can give it that. And the resource file is a little bit of extra info you can pass through if you want as well, but in our case, we don't need to. So this won't actually do the creation. The creation is handled by this thing that's this null, which that's the end name edit action. So when a user has finished editing it and finished it by saying, yep, I'm done, create this file, not by pressing escape or anything else to cancel, that end name action gets called. So we can create our own little handler for it. So what we have to create is an end name edit handler. Our name for that can be whatever we want. I'm just using that as the name for it. And that has to be based off of a Unity editor project window callback end name edit action. Quite a convoluted name. Now that will require a particular function in that. So we'll see with the error, the one that it's complaining about needs this action. So that resource file that we were passing in as null, that resource file gets fed through to this function if we need. Okay, well, we can create one of those. Now, something that's a little bit odd with these is these are actually based upon a scriptable object. So our name handler, or name edit handler, we have to actually create that by doing a scriptable object create instance. We provide it with our handler class, and we just make sure we've got the exact right name, which we do. So we can create that, and with that created, we can pass that in here instead of the null. Now that's good, but there's stuff we need to configure in this in terms of the mode. So I kind of want to be able to go, well, edit end name, edit handler. I want to be able to give it a bit of configuration. I want to be able to tell it stuff like, okay, well, here is the mode. It might also need the reference asset path. So the one that we're using as our reference point, it might need that. It would be quite likely for it to also need the class there. Now that class, I might actually pass that in as the full type in case later on we wanted to go even fancier with what was happening. So then I can configure this. So give it a configure, and it takes in a mode. It takes in a reference file path, and it also takes in a reference type. So this won't do anything just yet, and that's okay. What I will do is I'm just going to put a debug log here of the path name so that we know that it's completed, and I'm going to have the storage for all of these variables. So we'll just get it so that it's storing everything, and then we'll set it up so that it's actually doing the creation. So mode, just store everything over, and on a reference type. So we'll keep it fairly simple with the creation of the child class, but you absolutely could go more in depth with it. But we just want to test and see what happens. I should be able to get here and go, and I'll shrink this down so we can actually see the full file names. So code helpers, create child class. We can see it's got the correct name in there. And then when we close it, you can see it's provided the full file path there. So that's excellent. We can start having this do that actual creation then, because we've got all of the bits there that we need for this. So what I want to do is I actually want to create some templates, because this allows us to more easily extend this later on, and it's going to make our life sort of a lot easier for working with this. So I'm going to create a folder here called Code Templates, and then inside that I'm going to create, now we can't just go and directly create a little text file, but what I will do is I'll create a script. This one will be code template child class, and then I will also create one for a custom inspector. So this will be code template custom inspector. Now at the moment, these will have a CS extension, so they'll be treated as code and compiled. We don't want that because we're about to make changes to those that will actually make it that they won't compile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename these particular files. So I'm going to rename this so it doesn't have the CS extension. And I will do the same for this one. So I'll keep them as, I don't want it to be a specific extension, but I want it to be a text file. And then I'll be able to edit those. So I can bring both of those in here. And the reason for this is I want to, pretty much what I'm going to do is actually going to break these. So the child class, well, I'm going to change this to class name. And I'm going to change this to parent class name. And I will, for now, remove the void and start and for the update. Now, as I said, we're going to keep this fairly basic. It'll create a very bare bones class. But this is something where we could, and this is why I passed through the type, we could go pretty full on and identify things like abstract methods and have it implement those. We're not going to do that at this stage, but that absolutely is the kind of thing we could code generate. So that's good for the child class. Inspector one is going to be similar, except this we know has to be editor. This, again, is class name. I will actually, because it's an editor one, have in our on enable, I won't put in an onInspector GUI because this might be being used with the new UI elements, so I'll leave just the onEnable that is generally always going to be there. Or we can say custom editor and type of parent class name. Just like that. And in this, we would have using Unity editor. So that looks good. We've got our 2 templates. We have the things that need to be substituted in for them. So what we now need to do is we need to locate those templates and we need to then process them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make this a function, and what it's going to do is get template for current mode. And that will use our mode, and from that mode, it will know which particular template it is looking for. So I'm going to set up another little helper one, just because I want to translate mode into the actual file name. So template file for mode. And this is where we can make use of switch expressions. Makes it a little bit easier for setting up. So in this case, the child class one, we use this exact name. So we make sure file name matches exactly. So we get custom child class. So what we do is that returns that. Now we don't need the .txt, so you don't need the extension, but we did need the main part of the name of it. So this one will be code template custom inspector. Otherwise, the default, we throw a new argument out of range exception. So unknown mode. This is a good use of throwing an exception there for a case where if we add a new mode but don't update this, that'll make sure that error is quite loud and noticeable. So I need to try and retrieve those from the asset database. So what I can do is template GUIDs, and I can go, hey, asset database, I want you to find assets and firstly, get the file name. So get our file name that we would have. And then it must be a text asset. So that will retrieve only something that has that name and is a text asset. So it makes sure that we should be pretty confident that it's found it. So then I would check if template GUIDs length is anything other than 1. I'm going to return string empty. And what I'm going to do is I will also log an error. Found template GUIDs.length templates for the mode expected 1. So we give an indication of what we did find or didn't find potentially and what we expected to have happen. So we've error checked that, that's good. So then we can get the path to that where we can go, hey, asset database, GUID to asset path, template GUIDs, we grab the very first one, and I'm going to just do a file read, oops, we'll bring in our system IO actually as well, because we'll be using that a little bit, just makes the operations a little bit cleaner. So we can do a file read all text, like of that. So that's just going to bring the entire text content of that template in. So then when we're actually processing it, okay, template file, or template content might be a better name for it. We can then just use our function that we've got here for our get template for current mode, like that. Now, if that's not valid, so if template content, don't think there's a, yeah, that's not a one for just checking if it's empty. So if its length is 0, again, we exit immediately, and we can say here, failed to find template. Now we don't really need to log out anything more because the cases where this could be valid, we'd have the actual particular error there. Failed to find template or template was empty. So that's good. We now know we've got a valid file template at this point. So we can actually take that template content, we can start doing a replace because we know, okay, we need to replace class name. And so that will be replacing it with something. So in terms of what we replace that with, well, our new class name, this is where the functions from system.io come in handy. So we can say get file name without extension of the path name. That will give us, it will remove the directory section and it will remove the extension. So that is our new class name. We can then also do a replace of parent class name, and that is going to be our reference type name. Now this important thing, and this is something that's really, really easy to miss with replace, you can write lines like this and it'd be a case like, well, it's doing the replace, there's no errors, why isn't it working? Replace returns the updated string. So we have to do like of this. That's important for when we're recreating this. We have to go and do the actual assigning it back. So update the template. So we're pretty close to actually being done. You know, I could go and do write all text here right now to path name and that template content. I would actually rename that to new file content, is I think a better name for it. So we can write all of that. We can update the asset database then, because if you don't do the updating of the asset database, it won't appear immediately until something forces a refresh. So we can do an asset database import, we give it the path. We can then tell it, okay, a new script, if we load that asset, then, and when we load that asset, we can tell it this is a mono script, and then we can just make sure that is selected. So we go show created asset, which the name of that is not a particularly great function because what it does is it is going to make it so we've got it selected and everything. So it's going to work pretty well. But for a child class, big perfect. This will do everything we need. But for an editor class, well, editor classes need to be under the editor folder. So it'd be really, really nice if this automatically made sure of that. And we can do that. So what I'm going to do is this an editor class? So f our mode is custom inspector. then what I need to do is check if we're already under an edit folder. So I can split up the elements of the path. So path elements, path name, split, and importantly, we want to use path.directory separator char. We don't want to have it so that we're hard coding that, because if someone's running this on Windows versus Mac versus Linux, you can get errors there. So you always use the value from the path system there. So we can check, are we in an editor folder already? So tool is in editor folder, and we just go through each of those path elements. And we check, well, F path element, and let's make sure that we can't get issues with case sensitivity. So if element to lower exactly matches editor, then is in editor folder is true, and we can break. Then down here, we only care if we weren't in an editor folder. So F not is in an editor folder, then what we're doing is we need to create one. So again, our base path, we can go and get the directory name of the path we were going to be using. That's going to drop out the file name. We can also get just the actual file name, which we've got the class name here. If we want to just get the file name, yes, we could reconstruct it using the class name, but this is not something that's performance critical, so we might as well use the functions that are going to be sort of the clearest and most obvious, really. So then, well, path dot combine, we go path, so our base path, and editor. So our new path is that. We need to create that folder. And now this will handle if that already exists. So we can go create directory. We don't need to provide any. We don't need to use the additional one with the security stuff there. We can just use new path. And then path name, we just go and say path.combine new path with file name. So we work out where the editor folder will be, we create it, and then we generate the new name. So this should be working. We should be able to create a custom inspector, and it goes into the right folder. We should also be able to create a child class. So let's test it out. So I'm going to go to our code helpers, create child class, and we'll rename it so that we can test that the replacing is reliably happening. And we can actually see there is an error there. We've got an extra pound symbol in there. So that's all good. That just means that our replace, we likely, and we did. We missed a there. So we can go and test it again. But the naming was correct. So code helpers will create the child class. Demo of, you can see, correctly is set up, inherits. Now if we go and create an editor, so let's go code helpers and a custom inspector. So we've got the name of that, that's fine. And it has gone and created the editor folder for it. It's gone and set up our base one there. Let's do the same thing for the child class as well. So we'll create a custom inspector for it. And we can see it's gone and created the correct one, and it's there in the appropriate folder. So we've got our setup for being able to create child classes, custom inspector classes. We have a template here that we could easily modify. You could add in additional things that you might want to have it be substituting if needed. So we've got all of those sort of elements there up and running for it. So dive on in and experiment with it. See if there's additional things you want to add to the templates there. There might be, existing boilerplate or other things like that you want to add in. If you want to go for a more challenging edition, you could use reflection to find things like the abstract methods in a class and to be implementing those. You could even find properties that should be exposed in the inspector, and then in the editor ones actually generate a bunch of code for doing the inspector there for it. So there are a few different things like of that you could easily be setting up if you're wanting to dive on in. Thanks folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It really helps out, it's really appreciated. If you have any questions, chuck in a comment below. If you are looking for the code for the project, the code is available up on GitHub, and I've placed a link to that in the description below. If you are trying to track down other videos, I've got a searchable video archive that contains all of the videos, and you can search based upon descriptions and things like that, and I've put the link to that in the description as well. And finally, if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do it for Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description. But until next time, bye.